The morning sun cast long shadows across Roy Mackenzie's weathered porch as he sipped his coffee, watching dust devils dance across the arid New Mexico landscape. At 63, Roy's face was a roadmap of hard years, deep lines etched around pale blue eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. His ranch, Broken Spur, sat 30 miles outside Santa Fe, as isolated as the man himself. "Another day in paradise," he muttered to his border collie, Rusty, who lounged at his feet. The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but Roy wasn't fooled. Rusty was the only company he had these days, and even the dog seemed to judge him sometimes. The ranch had once been prosperous, 200 acres of cattle land with a respectable house and barn. Now it was just Roy, a skeleton crew of 20 cattle, and memories that refused to fade with time. The wooden sign at the entrance, hand-carved by his father decades ago, hung crooked from one chain, creaking with each gust of wind. Roy finished his coffee and set the mug down with a finality that punctuated his morning ritual. His joints protested as he stood, reminding him of old rodeo injuries and the years of hard labor that had bent his once straight posture into a permanent stoop. "Come on, boy. Fences won't fix themselves." Inside the barn, Roy gathered his tools, the familiar smell of hay and leather offering a comfort he'd never admit to needing. His truck, a 1993 Ford F-150 that had seen better days, started with a reluctant grumble. As he drove along the perimeter of his property, he mentally cataloged each broken fence post and sagging wire section. By midday, the New Mexico heat was merciless. Roy wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. He'd managed to replace 2 posts and reinforce a section of wire fencing before his back started to spasm. Age was the one opponent he couldn't outride or outwork. "Damn it all," he muttered, leaning against his truck. In the distance, the mountains stood indifferent to his pain, just as they had been indifferent to his joy decades ago. Back when Elizabeth was still alive, back before the accident, he returned to the house, just as his neighbor, Mike Callahan, pulled up in his shiny new pickup. "Afternoon, Roy," Mike called, stepping out with an energy that irritated Roy immediately. "Mike," Roy acknowledged with a nod. He didn't invite him in. He never did. "Just checking in. Heard from Sheriff Tanner that some cattle rustlers might be operating in the area. Thought you should know." Roy's expression didn't change. "Appreciate the warning." Mike hesitated, clearly hoping for more conversation. When none came, he sighed. "Martha asked if you'd like to come for dinner Sunday. She's making pot roast." "Tell her thanks, but I've got work to do." Mike's friendly smile faltered. "Roy, it's been 15 years. You can't keep." "I said I've got work." Roy cut him off, his voice sharp as barbed wire. After Mike left, Roy sat heavily in his kitchen chair, the silence of the house pressing in on him. On the wall hung a faded photograph. Roy, 20 years younger, standing proudly with his arm around a dark-haired woman whose smile could light up the darkest room. Beside them, a teenage boy with his mother's eyes and Roy's stubborn chin stood awkwardly, halfway between childhood and becoming a man. Roy couldn't look at the photo, but he couldn't take it down either. Elizabeth and James, his wife and son, the family he'd failed. That night, as he did most nights, Roy sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. The bottle beside him was a temptation he sometimes resisted, sometimes didn't. Tonight wasn't a night for resistance. "Should have been me," he whispered to the darkness. The car accident had taken Elizabeth instantly. James had survived, but the words they'd exchanged before he left for the army, bitter, angry words Roy had been too proud to take back, had created a gulf wider than death. Roy hadn't seen his son in 20 years. Last he heard, James had been deployed overseas. That was before Roy had stopped asking, stopped hoping for reconciliation. As the coyotes began their nightly chorus from the distant hills, Roy closed his eyes, letting the familiar ache of regret wash over him. Another day gone. Another night alone with his ghosts. The autumn morning arrived with a chill that penetrated Roy's bones as he stepped onto the porch. A low-hanging fog obscured the distant mountains, giving the landscape an otherworldly quality. Roy pulled his worn jacket tighter around himself, watching his breath form small clouds in the frigid air. His morning routine remained unchanged: coffee, a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, then out to check on the cattle. But something felt different today, a strange uneasiness he couldn't quite place. Rusty sensed it too, pacing restlessly by the door instead of settling into his usual spot by the fireplace. "What's got you all worked up?" Roy asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. Rusty whined, his dark eyes fixed on the driveway leading to the main road. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted, revealing a clear blue sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the New Mexico desert. Roy was in the barn, repairing a saddle, when Rusty suddenly bolted outside, barking frantically. Roy grabbed his rifle, more habit than necessity, and followed the dog. In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled an approaching vehicle. Few people came to Broken Spur these days. Fewer still were welcome. The vehicle, a mud-splattered black SUV with government plates, came to a stop at the gate. Roy approached cautiously, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. A tall figure emerged from the driver's side, and Roy squinted against the sun. The stranger was dressed in military fatigues, his posture straight as a rod. Something about the way he moved seemed familiar, but Roy couldn't place it. The man stood at the gate, not entering without permission, a courtesy rarely extended these days. "Can I help you?" Roy called out, maintaining his distance. The man took off his sunglasses, revealing dark eyes that struck Roy like a physical blow. "Hello, sir," he said, his voice deeper than Roy remembered but unmistakable nonetheless. "It's been a while." Roy's grip on his rifle tightened as recognition dawned. "James." His son nodded once, the gesture controlled and formal. Up close, Roy could see the changes 20 years had wrought. James was no longer the lanky teenager who had stormed out of the house all those years ago. He was a man now, with broad shoulders and a hardened expression. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing beneath his collar. "What are you doing here?" Roy asked, his voice gruff to hide the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I was discharged last month. Medical reasons." James gestured vaguely to his left leg, and Roy noticed for the first time a slight rigidity in his son's stance. "Thought it was time to come home." Home. The word hung between them, loaded with 2 decades of absence and unspoken regrets. "Does your mother know you're here?" The question slipped out before Roy could stop it, an old habit from when James would disappear for hours, exploring the ranch. James's expression softened slightly. "Dad, Mom's been gone 15 years. The reminder hit Roy like a punch to the gut. Of course James knew. He'd attended the funeral, standing stiffly on the other side of the grave, while Roy had been too consumed by grief and guilt to bridge the gap between them. "Right," Roy mumbled, suddenly aware of how old he must seem to his son. "I suppose you'd better come in then." The house felt smaller with James in it. Roy watched as his son took in the living room, noting the changes, and the things that had remained exactly the same. The photograph on the wall drew James's attention, and he stared at it for a long moment. "You kept it up," he said quietly. Roy busied himself making coffee, unable to meet his son's gaze. Never had a reason to take it down. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 strangers connected by blood and separated by everything else. The silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken apologies. "I heard about the ranch," James finally said. "Mike Callahan told me you've been struggling." Roy's pride flared. "We're getting by just fine." "That's not what he said." James looked around the kitchen, taking in the leaking faucet, the cracked linoleum floor. "He said you've been turning down help from everyone." "Don't need help," Roy muttered, though they both knew it was a lie. James took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "I didn't come here to argue. I came because—" He faltered, then straightened his shoulders like the soldier he was. "I came because I'm sick, Dad. Cancer. Doctors gave me about a year, maybe less." The words hit Roy like a physical blow. He stared at his son, seeing for the first time the pallor beneath his tanned skin, the slight hollowness in his cheeks. "Why here?" Roy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything?" James looked him directly in the eyes, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability that reminded Roy painfully of Elizabeth. Because before I die, I need to know if my father can forgive me for leaving, and if I can forgive him for letting me go. The following days established an uneasy rhythm. James moved into his old bedroom, which Roy had preserved like a museum exhibit, posters of 90s rock bands still taped to the walls, high school rodeo trophies gathering dust on the shelves. Roy had never had the heart to change it, though he rarely entered the room himself. They circled each other cautiously, like wary animals sharing territory. Conversations remained practical, focused on ranch work and immediate needs. James, despite his condition, insisted on helping with chores. Roy wanted to object but couldn't find the words to express his concern without sounding like he cared too much. Too late. On the third morning, Roy woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. He found James in the kitchen, moving with practiced efficiency despite the occasional grimace of pain. "You don't need to cook," Roy said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. James shrugged. "Military habit. Up early, make breakfast. Some things stick with you." He slid a plate of eggs and bacon across the counter. "Sit, eat." The food was good, better than the haphazard meals Roy typically made for himself. They ate in silence until James spoke. "I need to tell you about someone," he said, setting down his fork. "Her name is Lily." Roy looked up sharply. "Your wife." "My daughter," James corrected, reaching for his wallet. He pulled out a photograph of a solemn-faced girl with dark hair and familiar blue eyes, Mackenzie eyes. "She's 12. Lives with her mother in Colorado. After I got my diagnosis, He trailed off, staring at the photo. "Does she know about me?" Roy asked, his throat suddenly dry. "She knows she has a grandfather. She knows her grandmother died before she was born." James carefully returned the photo to his wallet. "She doesn't know much else." The implication hung in the air. Another generation of Mackenzies growing up without knowing their family, without understanding their heritage. Roy had failed his son, and now there was a granddaughter he'd never met. "I'd like to meet her," Roy said, surprising himself with the admission. James nodded slowly. "That's partly why I'm here. Her mother and we're not together anymore. Haven't been for years. But we both agreed that Lily should know her family. All of her family." Later that morning, they went to check the cattle together. Roy watched as James moved among the animals with natural ease, despite years away from ranch life. Some skills, it seemed, were embedded too deeply to be forgotten. "You should sell most of these," James observed, running a hand along the flank of an older cow. "Keep maybe 5 or 6 for breeding. Focus on quality over quantity." Roy bristled at the suggestion. "Been running cattle this way for 40 years. "And the ranch is failing," James replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "Times have changed, Dad. Methods have changed." "So now you're a ranching expert?" Roy couldn't keep the defensive edge from his voice. "No." James met his father's gaze steadily. "But I did get a degree in agricultural management before I enlisted, and I've spent the last 20 years learning how to assess situations objectively and adapt to changing conditions." The revelation caught Roy off guard. He'd never known about the degree. There was so much about his son's life that was a mystery to him. Choices made, paths taken, all while Roy had remained frozen in place, clinging to the past. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in from mountains. The power flickered and died as rain lashed against the windows. Roy lit kerosene lamps, their warm glow casting long shadows across the living room. Without the buffer of television or other distractions, the silence between father and son grew heavier. "Why didn't you ever call?" Roy finally asked, the question that had haunted him for 20 years. James stared into his glass of water. Pride at first, anger. He looked up at his father. Then shame. "The longer I stayed away, the harder it seemed to come back." "I looked for you," Roy admitted, "after your mother died. Try to find out where you were stationed." "I know," James said quietly. "They told me. I wasn't ready then." Roy swallowed hard. "And now?" "Why now, James?" "Because dying has a way of clarifying what matters." James's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. And because Lily deserves better than the legacy of silence we've created. As the storm raged outside, something began to shift between them. Not forgiveness yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. Roy thought of the granddaughter he'd never met, of the son he'd lost long before cancer threatened to take him permanently, of Elizabeth, who had always believed family could overcome anything. Tomorrow, Roy said slowly, we should talk about what needs fixing around here. If Lily's going to visit, the place should look decent. It wasn't much, not nearly enough to make up for 20 years of absence, but it was a start. James nodded, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Yes, sir, he said. I'd like that. The days following the storm brought clearer skies and tentative progress. Roy and James fell into a routine of working together on the ranch, tackling the long list of repairs that had accumulated over the years. They replaced rotted fence posts, patched the barn roof, and cleared debris from the dried-up creek bed that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Each day, James's movements grew slightly more labored, his rest breaks more frequent. Roy pretended not to notice, just as James pretended he wasn't in pain. Some things were still too fragile to acknowledge directly. On a crisp Saturday morning, Roy found James sitting on the porch, phone in hand, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. Everything all right? Roy asked, offering him a cup of coffee. James accepted the mug with a nod. Just got off the phone with Lily's mom. They're coming next weekend. He looked up at his father. If that's okay with you. Of course it is, Roy said gruffly, hiding his own anxiety behind a sip of coffee. Place'll be ready. They worked with renewed purpose that day, James directing their efforts toward making the ranch presentable. Roy found himself following his son's lead, noting the calm authority with which James assessed problems and devised solutions. It reminded him of Elizabeth, who had always been the practical one in their marriage. By late afternoon, exhaustion etched deep lines in James's face. Roy watched him struggle to lift a hay bale, his jaw clenched against obvious pain. That's enough for today, Roy announced. Let's head back. James started to protest, but stopped when Roy placed a hand on his shoulder, the first intentional contact between them since his arrival. The work will still be here tomorrow, Roy said quietly. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple, James broke their comfortable silence. I saw combat in 3 different countries, he said, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Lost friends. Made decisions I still have nightmares about. He paused, taking a slow breath. But leaving here, leaving things unresolved between us, that's been the heaviest burden. Roy's throat tightened. Those things I said to you before you left, I didn't mean them. Some of them you did, James replied without rancor. And some of them were true. I was reckless, selfish. You were 18, Roy countered. I was the adult. Should have known better than to let pride get in the way. The admission hung in the air between them. Roy thought of all the birthdays, Christmases, and ordinary days lost to stubbornness. Time he could never get back. Mom used to say we were too alike, James said, a hint of a smile softening his features. Both too stubborn to bend until something breaks. Roy nodded, remembering Elizabeth's exasperated fondness when mediating their arguments. She was usually right. Always right, James corrected, and they shared a brief, genuine laugh that felt like the first crack in a dam. The next morning, Roy woke early and drove into town, returning with supplies to repaint the house. James emerged from his room to find cans of paint and brushes arranged on the porch. What's all this? He asked, eyebrows raised. Thought we might give the old place some color, Roy replied, avoiding his son's gaze. Your mother always wanted it blue, said it would match the sky. Understanding dawned in James's eyes. Elizabeth had campaigned for years to paint the house, but Roy had always insisted the original white was practical and traditional. It had been one of their ongoing, good-natured disagreements. Blue is good, James said simply. They worked side by side, brushes moving in tandem across weathered boards. The physical labor seemed to energize James rather than drain him, as if each stroke of paint was an act of reclamation. Roy found himself sharing stories about the ranch's early days, about Elizabeth's garden that had once flourished behind the house, about the summer James had learned to ride. "I remember that horse," James said, smiling at the memory. "Old Thunderbolt. Gentlest animal that ever lived, despite the name." "You named him," Roy reminded him. "We're convinced he was as fast as lightning." "And he moved like our arthritic turtle," James laughed. "But he never threw me, not once." As the house transformed around them, something shifted in their relationship. Walls beginning to crumble, bridges starting to form. The blue paint covered years of neglect, giving the old ranch house new life. By sundown, they stood back to admire their work, the house now a gentle sky blue against the darkening landscape. That night, James's coughing spells grew worse. Roy lay awake listening to his son's labored breathing through the thin wall separating their rooms, feeling helpless against an enemy he couldn't see or fight. When the coughing finally subsided, Roy made a silent promise to Elizabeth, to himself, and to the granddaughter he had yet to meet. He would not waste whatever time they had left. The morning Lily was due to arrive dawned clear and bright. Roy found himself awake before sunrise, restless with anticipation and nerves. He made breakfast, pancakes from Elizabeth's old recipe, and was setting the table when James appeared, looking more haggard than usual. "Didn't sleep?" Roy asked, though the answer was evident in his son's exhausted eyes. James shook his head. "Nervous, I guess. It's been a few months since I've seen her." He poured himself coffee, with hands that trembled slightly. "She knows about my condition, but seeing the changes." He trailed off, staring into his mug. "Kids are resilient," Roy offered. "More than we give them credit for." They spent the morning making final preparations. Roy had cleared out the small office adjacent to the living room, transforming it into a bedroom for Lily, with freshly washed linens and a nightstand adorned with wildflowers James had collected from the property's edges. At noon, the sound of tires on gravel announced their arrival. Roy followed James onto the porch, hanging back slightly as a silver sedan pulled up to the newly painted house. A woman emerged first, tall, with sandy blonde hair and a cautious expression. She scanned the property before opening the rear door. The girl who stepped out made Roy's breath catch. She had Elizabeth's delicate features combined with the unmistakable Mackenzie eyes. She stood uncertainly beside the car until she spotted James, and then her solemn expression transformed into a smile that pierced Roy's heart with its familiarity. "Dad," she called, rushing forward to embrace her father. James knelt to meet her, holding her tightly despite the pain the movement clearly caused him. "Hey, Wildflower," he murmured into her hair. "I've missed you." Roy watched the reunion, feeling simultaneously like an intruder and a ghost, present but somehow insubstantial in this moment between father and daughter. When James finally straightened and turned toward him, Roy found himself frozen. "Lily," James said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is your grandfather, Roy Mackenzie." The girl regarded him with curious eyes, Elizabeth's shape, James's color, set in a face that somehow combined both while being entirely her own. She stepped forward, extending her hand with a formality that made Roy's throat tight. "Hello, sir," she said. "It's nice to finally meet you." Roy took her small hand in his weathered one, surprised by the strength in her grip. "It's nice to meet you too, Lily. Been looking forward to it." The woman, Catherine, James's ex-wife, approached with polite reserve. "Mr. Mackenzie, thank you for having us." "Call me Roy," he insisted, leading them inside. The afternoon unfolded with an awkward grace. Catherine remained watchful, but gradually relaxed as she observed the careful rapport building between Roy and Lily. The girl was curious about everything: the ranch, the animals, the photographs on the walls. "Is that my grandmother?" she asked, pointing to the picture of Elizabeth. "Yes," Roy answered, standing beside her. "Your grandmother Elizabeth. Prettiest woman in 3 counties and smart as a whip." "Dad says I have her smile," Lily said, studying the photograph. "You do at that," Roy agreed. "And her kindness, too, I'll bet." After dinner, while Catherine helped James with his medication, Roy took Lily out to see the horses. The old quarter horse gelding nuzzled the girl's hand gently as she offered him an apple. "Have you ever ridden?" Roy asked. Lily shook her head. "Mom says horses are dangerous." "They can be, if you don't respect them," Roy acknowledged. "But a good horse is the best friend you'll ever have." He hesitated, then added, "I taught your father to ride when he was about your age. Could teach you too, if your mom agrees." "Really?" Lily's face lit up. "Could we start tomorrow?" "We'll see," Roy said, but he was already planning how to convince Catherine. Later, as twilight settled over the ranch, Roy found James sitting on the porch, watching Lily explore the front yard. "She's something special," Roy said, lowering himself into the adjacent chair. "She is," James agreed. "Smart, stubborn, fearless." He glanced at his father. "Reminds me of you sometimes." The compliment caught Roy off guard. Got more of her grandmother in her, I think. They sat in companionable silence, watching Lily chase fireflies in the gathering darkness. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what happens after I'm gone." He kept his eyes on his daughter. "Catherine has a good job in Denver, a stable life. But Lily needs family. She needs roots." Roy understood what his son was asking. "This place has been in our family for 4 generations, he said simply. "It'll be here for her. I'll be here for her." James nodded, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. "Thank you." As night fell completely, Catherine called Lily inside. The girl ran up the porch steps, but paused before entering the house. Without warning, she threw her arms around Roy's waist in a quick, fierce hug. "Good night, Grandpa," she said, and then she was gone, disappearing into the house before Roy could respond. "Grandpa," Roy repeated softly, the word unfamiliar but right. He looked at his son, finding James watching him with a mixture of pain and peace in his eyes. "Welcome home," Roy said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the ranch.